South African consumers say they have only enough money for food, shelter, and basic goods. That's according to a survey by a global consulting company, NielsenIQ. The results are echoed by local economists, citing pressure on the disposable incomes of consumers. Joining us now to discuss this is Dr. Azar Jammine, who is the chief economist at Econometrix. Dr. Jammine, thank you for making time for us. I suppose there's no question that consumers are under strain thanks to the rising interest rates and soaring inflation. So it's not really surprising then that from this study, half of the South African consumers say their financial positions has worsened in the last year.
There's one other aspect that you have left out in this, and that is the high rate of unemployment. If people are unemployed, they receive no income, they struggle to keep up with any form of living. They're dependent on social grants, and those don't go very far in terms of enabling them to keep up with the cost of living, especially when fuel and food prices on which they're very dependent are rising so sharply. But yes, more generally, even those who do have jobs have been feeling the pinch because in most cases salaries have not been rising in line with a higher rate of inflation. Having said that, this is to some extent now a worldwide phenomenon. The difference is that it's obviously a function of COVID-19 and the fact that many things were shut down over that time. But other governments in the world spent a huge amount of money trying to minimize the impact of COVID-19 on the average consumer, with the result that now that lockdowns have been lifted, those consumers suddenly find that they've got a little more money available with which to not only keep pace with inflation, but actually spend on things that they were not spending on previously. In South Africa's case, the amount of stimulus that the government was able to afford during lockdown was minimal. And this is largely due to the fact that the government's resources were eaten up so badly in the preceding decade by state capture. So, you've got a handful of people who benefited enormously from state capture who are still living very well, but the majority of people, there was not enough money to help them survive in this kind of distress.
Do you think there's still an opportunity for government to provide that stimulus? There are new factors now, not so new, but I suppose the worsening energy crisis is leading to a lot of small businesses that are really struggling to stay afloat. People are losing their jobs. Is there still an opportunity for government to provide that stimulus, or are we talking about a government that doesn't have money?
In fact, what has happened is the government's got less money available now to spend on stimulus than it had before, precisely because of electricity load shedding and businesses going under, because the worse it becomes for the economic growth, the less tax revenue that government is able to raise and the less money that it has available to spend on all these other projects. The only way in which it can start spending more is to print money. And we know that that is a very short-term solution. It would resolve the problem for a year or so, and before you knew it, we would have massive inflation and a huge depreciation of the rand, and people would end up with even higher interest rates, much higher interest rates than those that we've got. You've got to bear in mind that our interest rates have gone up, but they had been reduced by 3%. During the lockdown, and that was the biggest stimulus that was able to be afforded by the public sector through the Reserve Bank. The 3% drop in the prime overdraft rate in 2020 from 10.5% to 7%. That was the biggest benefit. But now you can't keep doing that all the time, especially when inflation has risen so much.
Yeah. Are things going to get better anytime soon, Dr. Jammine? I mean, suppose that's what some people are wondering, right, who are financially squeezed. There are those who argue things have been stabilizing this year when you look at staples such as food and fuel, but there are others who say, well, the prices are still too high.
Well, the prices are very high. They've maybe stabilizing a little more, but at a very high level. On the fuel price front, we had a little bit of respite in the last couple of months, but bad news is headed for March because oil prices started rising again, and the rand has fallen to its lowest level in 4 months. You said, are things going to get any better anytime soon? The answer is no, they're not going to get better anytime soon. The anytime soon, it depends how long you mean by that. For things to get better, we have to have major structural reforms of the economy. We've got to see an end to load shedding. We've got to see government starting to invest massively in infrastructure again. We've got to see a resolution to the hopeless state of state-owned enterprises. We've got to see people starting to be educated far better than they are doing right now so that they can command a job and add value to the economy. And all those challenges are going to take not anytime soon, but many years. So, no, we can't see any major recovery in the economy in the next year or two. If you want to be optimistic, you've got to look 5 years out, 10 years out, to look to a complete overhaul of the political landscape and having people in charge who have the interests of the country as their priority rather than their party.
Yeah. How are those that are financially squeezed, right, those South Africans that are financially squeezed, staying above the water? I know some people have been, going online on online platforms to search for better deals. There are those that are saving on petrol. How do you think they're staying afloat?
There has been a tendency, and first of all, you've got to realize that 85% of what is spent in the economy is spent by 15% of the population. And 15% of what is spent by 85% of the population. So the effects in terms of survival are very different depending on which section of the population you're talking about. But certainly in the lower to middle income groups, what we have seen, people generally who have jobs and are struggling because of the high cost of living, but they have jobs and a certain amount of income, they've started resorting to borrowing money a little more than they were doing at any stage in the preceding 8 years or so. You had a big borrowing splurge around 2006 to 2008. Then again in 2011-12, it saw the collapse of African Bank. You'll recall a lot of micro-lending was taking place at that time. And the fallout was so severe that for about 8 years, people have not been borrowing very much. Suddenly, what we are starting to see over the last year, and that is what has helped prevent a total collapse of consumer spending, is people have started resorting again to borrowing a little. The capacity to do so is there because not having borrowed for so long, debt levels are not all that high on the whole. But again, it depends very much on which specific category of income group you're looking at.
Yeah. I'm glad you've also, touched on some people that are taking more debt, and I mean they're paying higher interest rates on this as well. I want to talk about now some of where people are spending this money, right? Isn't the problem that the areas where they're spending the money, when you look at, food, fuel, electricity, that's where the inflation is also worse, isn't it?
That is where the inflation has been worse. It may not continue that way. As I mentioned, there are some hopeful signs that food and fuel inflation might come off the boil, except on the food side now, load shedding is exacerbating the situation because it's forcing a lot of food producers to destroy some of their food supplies or not be able to produce as much because there's not enough scope for refrigeration. But on the whole, international food prices have come off the boil, and the same with oil prices, except in the very short term. Russia's now started reducing output, and that's caused oil prices to surge again last week. But on the whole, there's not a massive increase of the kind that we had a year ago. So one is hopeful there. But, if you look at, I've been looking at the statistics on the categories non-durable consumption of non-durable goods, semi-durable, and durable goods. In other words, your essentials versus your semi-essentials and your luxuries, if you want to put it that way. The growth rate in all three categories was very, very similar last year, funnily enough. The growth in the amount that people spent on cars and appliances did not slow as much as one might have expected. And again, this speaks to the need to actually distinguish between different categories of consumers. You can't just talk about the consumer. There are different categories. Middle to upper income groups have been able to carry on affording to buy what one might call luxuries, whereas the lower income groups have been obviously compelled to spend most of their money on food and fuel. And on average, the growth in consumption of each of these categories has not differed one from the other too much. Mm-hmm. What we've seen is a marked slowdown in the demand for building materials, and that is where a lot of strain is taking place. With very little infrastructural investment, demand for building materials has fallen very sharply. Also, we had a spurt during COVID when people started building a lot to provide work from home opportunities. That phase has also disappeared. But and your large retail stores, their growth in business is average. It's not startling. Yeah. What I can say is growth in spending by consumers overall is a lot higher than growth in production by the manufacturing sector or the mining sector. And I just heard in your preceding clip, Nomvula Mokonyane talk about we need to industrialize. It's all very well to say that. It's not happening. We're going the opposite way. We've become a nation of consumers rather than producers, unfortunately.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. And also almost everything has been going up, but the wages, salaries haven't really been keeping up with the increase in these staples, and that isn't helping at all. Dr. Azar Jammine, Chief Economist at Econometrix, thank you so much for making time for us.